This happened a few years ago when I was living in a mid-sized city in the Midwest. I had just gotten out of grad school and landed my first stable job at a marketing firm. I didn't have a lot of money, so I rented the cheapest apartment I could find in a relatively safe area. The building was an old brick 3-story with 6 units, 2 on each floor. I ended up in apartment 3A, right at the top. It was small but functional, the kind of place you live when you're just starting out and don't plan to stay long. The windows were drafty, the radiators hissed in the winter, and the elevator hadn't worked in years, but it was home, quiet for the most part. The landlord was lazy but harmless, and the other tenants kept to themselves, all except the woman in 2B. Her name was Rhonda. She was probably in her late 40s or early 50s, with dyed black hair that was always a bit wild and dark circles under her eyes that never seemed to fade. She dressed in layers, even in the summer, and carried a worn leather shoulder bag that bulged with God knows what. I didn't meet her until my second week there. I was coming back from the laundromat with a load of clothes and nearly bumped into her in the stairwell. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at me, wide-eyed, like I'd surprised her. Then she said, "Are you the one who moved in upstairs?" I nodded. "Yeah, apartment 3A. You have a microwave?" she asked. Yeah. She nodded slowly, then said, "Watch what you put in it," and kept walking. That was our first interaction. I assumed she was just eccentric, maybe a bit paranoid. I worked with a few people like that, no big deal. But over the next few months, things got weirder. At first, it was small things. I'd come downstairs and find Rhonda standing in the hallway outside her apartment, just standing there, not doing anything, sometimes holding her bag, sometimes not. She wouldn't acknowledge me, just stand perfectly still and stare down the hall like she was waiting for someone who never came. Other times I'd hear her talking, not to someone, just talking. Through the floor vents, I'd catch snippets of what she said, things like, "They put it in the water again." "No, I didn't agree. I never agreed. Stop sending them. Stop sending them. Stop sending them." It didn't sound like a phone call. It sounded like she was arguing with the air. I figured she probably had some kind of untreated schizophrenia or delusional disorder. I wasn't scared of her exactly, more concerned, but I wasn't equipped to deal with that, and honestly, it wasn't my business. I tried to stay polite but distant. Then came the knocking. It started one night around 2:30 a.m. A loud, sharp knock at my door. I jolted awake, heart racing. I waited, another knock, then silence. I got up and looked through the peephole. No one. This happened again the next week. Same time, same pattern. 3 sharp knocks. I opened the door that time. Again, no one. The hallway was empty. But as I turned to go back inside, I heard her door, 2B, click shut softly. That's when I started getting nervous. One afternoon I came home from work and found a note taped to my door. Just a sticky note with sloppy handwriting that said, "You're being watched. They know you microwave eggs." I stood there, just baffled. I had in fact microwaved eggs that morning, just scrambled some in a bowl with salt and cheese. But how would she know that? I didn't see her, didn't tell anyone. The door next to mine opened just a crack. Rhonda peeked out. "Don't listen to them," she whispered. "They'll try to use you." Then she shut the door again. I reported it to the landlord, but he didn't care. Said, "She's been here longer than me. As long as she's not dangerous, I can't throw her out." The thing was, she didn't seem dangerous, just unstable and sad in a way that was hard to define, but things escalated. One night, I came home late, around 11:30, and the hallway smelled wrong, like metal and burnt plastic. I followed it down and realized it was coming from under Rhonda's door. I knocked, no answer. I called the fire department just in case. They showed up, banged on her door, announced themselves, still no answer. Eventually, they forced it open. I was standing down the hall when they went in. I couldn't see much, but I heard one of the firefighters say, "Jesus Christ." They escorted Rhonda out a few minutes later. She was fine. Physically anyway, but her apartment, I don't know how to describe it. Stacks of newspapers everywhere, dozens of burned out candles, tinfoil taped over every surface, walls, windows, ceiling. She'd painted over her appliances. The microwave door was gone entirely. Inside, there were shards of broken CDs and a crushed cell phone. They found dozens of notebooks, all filled with scrawled writing, not legible, just symbols and numbers and nonsense. The firemen cleared the place, made sure there was no fire hazard. The building manager showed up. Rhonda just stood outside in the courtyard the whole time, holding that leather bag, mumbling to herself. They didn't arrest her. She wasn't violent, just clearly not well. That should have been the end of it. But a few days later, she came back. Same apartment, same behavior, only now, she was obsessed with me. I started finding more notes, slipped under my door, wedged into my car's windshield wipers. "They're using you to record. I can see the lens. You're not hiding it well. Stop cooking the messages." I started parking on the street instead of the building lot. Started using headphones all the time, so I couldn't hear her through the walls. I even considered moving, but breaking the lease would have cost me too much. Then one night, she tried to get into my apartment. It was around 3 a.m. I woke up to the sound of metal scraping. I crept out of bed and peered through the peephole. Rhonda was standing at my door with a butter knife, trying to jam it into the lock. I yelled. She froze, then ran back to a unit. I called the cops. They came, talked to me, then knocked on her door. She didn't open. They couldn't force entry without cause. I gave them the notes, the video from my cheap hallway cam. They said they'd file a report. I don't know what happened after that, whether she got scared or someone else intervened. But the next week, she was gone. Her apartment was cleared out. A crew came in, cleaned the place top to bottom. I never saw her again. The landlord told me she'd been placed in care. I never found out more. Here's the thing that haunts me though. A few months later, I was going through some old moving boxes. Found one I'd never unpacked. Inside was a stack of books, random kitchen stuff, and a notebook I didn't recognize. I opened it. Inside were pages and pages of writing. Rhonda's handwriting. It was a journal, but not hers. Mine. Or at least it was about me. Entries about what I wore when I left the house, what I ate, specific conversations I'd had on the phone. It was detailed, obsessively so. And the last page, it read 3:07 a.m. He looked at me. I think he finally heard it too. I grew up in a small Missouri town where everyone knew everyone, and gossip traveled faster than the morning mail. It was the kind of place where a crooked mailbox could become a topic of discussion for a week, and people remembered who lived where for the past 40 years. On Maple Street, where I inherited my uncle's old house, there was one figure who had been at the center of local legend for as long as anyone could remember, Eloise Carter. No one called her that though. To the locals, she was simply the witch of Maple Street. She lived in the last house before the tree line, a sagging two-story thing with ivy strangling its sides and a front porch that groaned under its own weight. Her property was a tangle of wild growth and bizarre objects, glass bottles hanging from tree branches, wind chimes made of spoons, rusted weather vanes turned in the wrong directions. She kept to herself, never joined town meetings, never attended Sunday services. Her windows were always covered with thick drapes. Her mailbox bore no name, yet she was always there. The day I moved in, I saw her for the first time. Tall, unnaturally thin, dressed in a long faded skirt and layers that made no sense for the warm weather. Her gray hair hung in a braid that reached down to her back. She stood in her yard, staring at me without expression as I unloaded boxes. She didn't wave, she didn't smile, she just watched. At first, I dismissed her as harmless, a local eccentric, but that changed quickly. She had routines. Every evening, at the same time, she walked around her yard, touching each fence post in a slow, deliberate pattern. 3 full loops every night. Her boots made soft thuds on the grass, rhythmic and methodical. I started noticing that when she finished, she would stop and stare directly at my bedroom window for a moment before returning inside. Strange items began appearing near my property line. A feather nailed into the ground, a half-melted candle in a saucer, once a bundle of sticks tied together with red twine. They weren't on my land exactly, but just close enough to make a point. My dog, normally fearless, refused to go near the side of the yard facing her house. He would whine, tail tucked, avoiding that side entirely during walks. I began to feel watched, not occasionally, constantly. I would glance up from doing dishes and see a shift in her curtain. When I watered the plants, I would feel the weight of her eyes from behind her porch screen. And then there was the crow. One morning I stepped out to find a perfectly intact crow laid gently on my porch mat. Its eyes were still open. A thin thread was tied around its leg, nothing attached, just a knot. I disposed of it carefully, trying to shake the unease. The next day, another crow. Same condition, same string. Soon after, the notes started appearing. Folded slips of paper slid under my door overnight. The handwriting was shaky and inconsistent, written in graphite that smudged under the touch. Each one held a sentence. None had names. You shouldn't let the porch light stay on. Don't forget which way the wind turns. You left something open. I told myself it was just the ramblings of someone mentally unwell. I considered contacting the authorities, but what would I say? An old woman left vague notes and crows on my porch? One night I woke to the sound of movement, not in my house, but just outside my bedroom window. The rustling of dead leaves, the deliberate crunch of a boot on gravel. I turned on the outside light. The yard was empty, but the next morning, all of my garden tools had been removed from the shed and laid out in a perfect semicircle on the lawn. I stopped sleeping well. My dog became increasingly nervous, growling at corners, whining when left alone. I began locking everything, windows, shed, even the interior doors. The tipping point came on a cold morning in early winter. I found my back gate open and footprints in the frost leading up to my my back porch. There were no signs of entry, nothing stolen or disturbed, but someone had stood there for a long time, impressions deep and deliberate. I had a motion-activated trail camera set up in the backyard for wildlife. When I checked the footage, I found a grainy clip at 3:14 a.m., a tall figure, barefoot despite the cold, standing silently at the edge of my porch. She didn't approach the door, she just stood there for nearly 10 minutes facing the house. After that, I stopped going outside at night. I moved my bed to a different room. The tension became constant, like a tight string stretched too far. Even when she wasn't visible, her presence seemed to saturate the air. Eventually, I called the sheriff's office. They listened patiently, took notes, and sent a deputy to do a wellness check. He came back shaking his head, said she didn't answer. Her yard was overgrown, the windows too thickly covered to see inside, but there was no legal reason to break in, no probable cause. She wasn't a threat, she was just strange. Soon after, she disappeared. No one saw her leave, no moving truck, no family visits, nothing, just silence. Her mailbox began to fill with yellow slips. The bottles in the trees clinked in the wind, untended. A few weeks later, an official-looking vehicle showed up, public health or some kind of housing authority. They entered the house, stayed there for hours. Word spread that she had been taken in for mental health evaluation. The property was declared uninhabitable. I avoided the house for a long time, but one day curiosity got the better of me. I walked past slowly. The front door was open, trash bags were piled on the porch. From the street I could see inside. Dozens of jars lined the shelves, bundles of dried herbs hung from the ceiling, symbols were drawn in chalk on the floor, and pinned to the wall were dozens of photographs. Blurry, poorly lit, but unmistakable. They were all pictures of me, watering the lawn, leaving for work, sitting on my porch. One photo, pinned dead center, had writing on the bottom: "He sees but does not believe." I never went back down that street again. This is something I've never really told anyone outside of a few friends, and even then, I downplayed how uncomfortable it made me. It happened a few years ago when I was living alone in a small apartment building in St. Paul, Minnesota. I had just gotten a new job and needed something cheap but decent. The place I ended up in was a 1970s-era 4-unit building. 2 floors, plain brick, kind of depressing, but the rent was good and the neighborhood felt safe. I moved into Unit 2 on the ground floor. Above me was Unit 4. The woman who lived there was probably in her late 50s or early 60s. Everyone called her Miss Lorraine. She had been there for years, apparently since the late 90s, and the landlord mentioned she was quiet and reliable. She was polite the first time I met her. Thin, neatly dressed, but in an odd sort of way, long skirts, old sweaters even in the summer, hair always in a tight bun. She spoke softly, with this careful, clipped tone, like someone who'd been raised with strict manners and a firm sense of personal space. I thought nothing of it at first. We shared a brief hello whenever we passed in the stairwell, and that was it. Then I noticed the visitors. Miss Lorraine had a lot of them, not family or friends exactly. These were strangers, men and women of all ages, usually alone, always arriving in the late afternoon or evening. They never stayed long, 20, 30 minutes at most. Some didn't even go inside. They'd knock, she'd open the door, they'd talk briefly, then leave. Others went in and came out visibly shaken. Once I saw a guy step out of her unit wiping tears from his eyes. It didn't seem like anything illegal. It didn't have that kind of vibe, but the frequency was strange. 5 or 6 different visitors a day, almost every day. I assumed maybe she was a therapist working from home. That would make sense, right? Private practice, older woman, quiet demeanor. But then I started noticing things that didn't add up. The visitors never brought bags, notebooks, or even phones. And I never heard conversation through the ceiling. No murmur of voices, no laughter, no crying, even though the walls were thin and I could always hear her walking around. Sometimes the footsteps didn't match a person just pacing. They were too rhythmic, too patterned, like she was walking in circles deliberately. One night I was taking out the trash and passed a man standing at her door. He looked totally normal, jeans, jacket, early 30s, but his hands were shaking. I asked if he was okay. He said, without looking at me, "I'm just here to apologize." Before I could ask anything else, the door opened and he stepped inside. After that, I started paying more attention. I'd sit near my window some evenings and count how many people came by. Sometimes it was just 2. Other times it was 8 or more, arriving one after the other. Always the same. Brief knock, brief visit, then gone. One evening I tried listening through the vent in my ceiling. I figured if she was a counselor or doing some kind of spiritual healing or therapy, I might catch some of it. What I heard was humming, very soft, low humming, like a lullaby sung under the breath, not constant, just here and there, between footsteps, and always just one voice, hers. Then one day, a woman came to my door instead, mid-40s, well-dressed, holding a small white envelope. She looked confused. "Is this Lorraine's?" she asked. "Unit 4? I told her she was one floor up." The woman thanked me, then paused. "She still does the..." She gestured vaguely. "You know, the meetings?" I said I wasn't sure. She nodded, muttered, "Hope so," and went upstairs. When she came back down 15 minutes later, she looked lighter. I know how that sounds, but it's true. Her posture, her face, everything looked relieved, like something had been lifted. And then I realized something else. No one ever came back a second time. It was always new people, different ages, races, backgrounds, never the same face twice, not once in over 8 months. So I asked the landlord about her. He shrugged, said she paid rent early, never asked for anything, and had lived there longer than anyone else. When I pressed about the visitors, he just laughed. People say she used to do readings, psychic stuff, back in the 2000s. Maybe she still does. But it didn't feel like psychic stuff. It wasn't performative. It was too quiet, too serious. No incense, no signs, no advertising. Just a woman behind a plain door that people seemed to seek out like it was the last thing they needed to do before moving on. One day I left for work and passed a girl sitting on the building steps crying silently. Maybe early 20s. She didn't look up as I passed. When I got home later that night, she was gone. And Miss Lorraine's apartment door was slightly open. A week before I moved out, I finally worked up the nerve to say something. I ran into her in the laundry room. I said I'd seen a lot of people visiting her and asked if she was a counselor. She smiled, genuinely, but with a sad edge to it. "I help people when they're ready to let go," she said. That's all. I wanted to ask more, but her tone ended the conversation. When I moved out, I left a note at her door. Just a thank you for being a quiet neighbor and for the strange sort of comfort her presence brought me, even if I didn't understand it. A month later, I got a letter in the mail. No return address, just a plain card inside. On it was a single sentence. "Some people aren't meant to carry what they do. Thank you for noticing anyway. I still don't know what she did up there, but I think about her a lot, and the steady stream of people who came to see her just once." This story doesn't have a big climax, no police reports, no dramatic confrontations, but it's the one that still keeps me up at night when I let my mind wander too long. I think the scariest experiences are the ones that leave you with nothing conclusive. No resolution, no real understanding of what just happened. Only that something did. Back in 2019, I was living in a mid-sized city in upstate New York, in a quiet, working-class neighborhood not far from a train station. I'd recently gone through a rough breakup and was trying to rebuild. I rented the top floor of a duplex house. Kitchen, 2 small bedrooms, private entrance through a narrow staircase at the back. The lower unit was occupied by an older woman named Carol, who had lived there for decades and mostly kept to herself. The house backed up to an alley that ran behind several other homes and small garages. Nothing sketchy, just a place where people stored old cars, wheeled out trash bins, or parked their second vehicles. My living room window looked directly out over it. It started with a red Toyota Camry. The car showed up one morning, parked directly behind our property. Nothing strange about that. People parked there all the time, but the car never left. Days passed, then a week, then 2. It was always in the same exact spot. At first, I assumed it belonged to a neighbor who didn't drive much. Then I started noticing things. Almost every morning, around 5:30 a.m. before the sun came up, the driver would appear. I only caught brief glimpses. A man, mid to late 40s, average build, always in a dark hoodie. He'd sit in the car for about 20 minutes, not reading, not on the phone, just sitting. Then he'd get out, lock the door, and walk off down the alley. I never saw where he went. The first few times, I didn't think much of it. I told myself maybe he worked night shifts or lived nearby and used the alley as a shortcut, but it kept happening every day. Always the same car, same routine, same time. After a month, I started to wonder how no one else noticed. I asked Carol downstairs if she knew whose car it was. She said she hadn't seen it. She almost never opened her back window. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. One morning, I got up early and waited. I kept the light off and peeked through the blinds as the man showed up again. He got in the car and just sat there like always. Head down, hands on his lap. No phone, no movement. Then I noticed something chilling. He was staring up, directly at my window. I ducked, waited a minute, slowly looked again. He was still looking. not in a caught me watching kind of way, more like he'd been looking long before I noticed. He didn't seem surprised. He didn't even move. Just that pale face faintly visible through the windshield. The next morning, I didn't look, but the car was still there. And it was still there the next morning, and the one after that. At this point, I started wondering if I was overreacting. Maybe the guy had a routine, maybe I was reading too much into it. But something about the whole situation felt wrong. I couldn't shake it. One night, I came home late after drinks with coworkers. It was after midnight. I turned the corner and saw the red Toyota. The alley was empty otherwise. The car was off, dark, but something told me to check. I walked closer. He was inside, sitting perfectly still, head turned towards me, eyes open. I kept walking like I hadn't seen him, but every hair on my body stood up. The next day, I started writing down the times I saw the car, when he showed up, how long he stayed. I tried to make sense of it. There was no pattern beyond the 5:30 a.m. visit. Some days he stayed longer, sometimes not at all, but the car never moved. He never spoke to anyone, never carried anything, and then the photos started. It began with one envelope on my doorstep, no return address. Inside were 3 printed photos. Me, leaving my house, walking to the store, talking to Carol, all from a distance, all taken from the alley, no note, no explanation. I brought them to the police. They told me unless the man was trespassing or actively threatening me, there wasn't much they could do. They sent a patrol car by the next morning. Of course, the man didn't show up that day, but the day after, the car was there again. He was in it, looking up. I tried to confront him once. I walked down the alley late in the morning and stood a few feet from the car. The windows were tinted just enough to obscure his eyes, but I could see him sitting there, motionless, ignoring me. I knocked on the driver's side window, nothing. I raised my voice. "Do you live around here?" He didn't respond, just kept staring forward. Eventually, I walked away. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 3 a.m., I got up and looked out the back window. The car was gone. I stared at the empty spot for a long time. Then I went back to bed. The next morning, the car was back. Same spot, same position, as if it had never left. That weekend, I left town to visit family. When I came back Sunday evening, Carol stopped me at the mailbox. She looked pale. She told me that someone had knocked on her door late Friday night. When she looked through the peephole, she saw a man in a hoodie, standing with his back to her door, not moving. He stayed there for several minutes before walking off. She hadn't seen his face, but when I asked her what direction he walked, she pointed toward the alley. That was enough. I moved out a month later. I never found out who he was. I never saw him again after I left. But sometimes, in the early mornings, I'll wake up suddenly. No sound, no dream. Just this overwhelming urge to check the window. And even now, in a different city, a different state, in a different apartment altogether, I still do. I still look, just to be sure there's no red Toyota parked outside.